completely reconfigured the whole room as well. But thank you so much for coming tonight to the Science Gallery for our panel discussion, Trust in Trouble, How Can We Do Democracy Differently? My name's Suzanne. I'm Director of Engagement at the Policy Institute at King's College London. And I'm joined tonight by Kerry Davis, Director of the Centre for Deliberation at NatSen. Over the past year or so, we've been running a number of these seminars, all online to date, looking at different aspects of deliberative theory and practice and bringing together theorists and academics and practitioners to understand how we can think about deliberative approaches, how we can learn from each other, and how we can learn what works as well. We've been trying to go for a kind of 17th century salon vibe, but with much less taffeta. And tonight is the first in-person event, and we're really thrilled that you're here with us. We're also delighted to be joined by a brilliant panel who are all going to bring different perspectives on how we can do democracy differently. First up, we have Douglas Alexander, who served as an MP between 1997 and 2015. In that time, he held a variety of cabinet roles from Foreign Office, International Development, Transport, Work and Pensions, and since leaving Westminster, he's worked at Harvard, University of Chicago, and we're very lucky to have him as a visiting professor at the Policy Institute at King's. He's also recently won selection to stand in the next election, which hopefully is not too long away. We're also delighted to be joined by Jane Souter, Professor in the School of Communications at Dublin City University. In 2011, Jane was one of the founder members of We the Citizens, Ireland's deliberative experiment, which paved the way for constitutional reform on abortion. Anyone who works in the field of deliberative democracy owes Jane and her work such a huge debt, and we're really thrilled that she is here to share her expertise with us tonight. And finally, but by no means least, we have Miriam Levine. Miriam is a powerhouse. She is Chief Executive of Engage Britain. They're a charity that works to open up policy making, putting people most affected by decisions at the heart of them. They've worked on complex and intractable social policy issues like health, social care, poverty, and prior to working at Engage, Miriam was Head of Community Action for UK governments. But before we get into the discussion tonight with our excellent panelists, we thought it'd be helpful to set the scene, to think about why we might need to think about doing democracy differently. And to help us do this, we're going to draw on some of the findings from the latest round of the World Values Survey. This is an ESRC-funded multi-country study which we're running at the Policy Institute at King's. It's one of the longest-running social attitudes studies. It's a treasure trove of incredibly interesting and also alarming findings. But I think let's start with some reasonably good news. And that's that we haven't lost faith in democracy yet. And in fact, we're more positive about democracy than in previous years. So in 1999, when Douglas was in government, 3/4 of people thought that democracy was a good way of governing the country. And this has risen to 92% in 2018. It achieved virtually the same score in the last wave of the survey in 2022. And much of this shift comes from a growing share of the public who identify democracy as a very good way of governing. 2/3 of the people said this in 2022. But we support democracy in theory, but democracy in theory is very, very different to democracy in practice. I support Aston Villa in theory, but that's very, very different to turning up on a wet Saturday afternoon in November. And our lived experience of democracy is a very, very different thing. And very few, only 1 in 6, are highly satisfied with how the country's political system is functioning. Double the proportion are dissatisfied with it, and about half put it in between. If you want to think about it in another way, we're about on a par with Russia. In this survey, we also asked as well asked people how democratically they think that the country is governed, and only 2 in 5 identify the UK as highly democratic. And although we're on a par with Spain and France, we're scoring much lower on this than our European neighbours like Sweden, Norway, Germany, and we're scoring lower than Iran as well. Makes us pretty much table, and if you'll forgive me another football joke, it does make us the Tottenham Hotspur of functioning democracies. We're also losing confidence in our political institutions as well. So if you look at this chart here, I'm going to bring up all the lines. Only 2/3 have confidence in the police at the minute, and you might think, what with everything that's gone on, 2/3 who've got confidence in the police is not a bad score, but that is down from 9 in 10. Only a quarter have confidence in Parliament, and again that's down from 2 in 5 in 1981, and only 13% have confidence in the press. It's important to note that this isn't a new crisis of trust. These figures haven't been great for some time now, but there are worrying signs of things coming down the line. When you analyse the figures for Gen Z separately, they're scoring particularly poorly on all these measures. And the other thing to say too is, we might be used to these figures, but if you look at other countries, they're not the norm either. We're scoring very badly when you compare us to other countries. So if you look at the percentage who have confidence in the government, about half of citizens in Canada say that they have confidence in government. That's twice as many as do here. And if you look at the press, it's only Egypt that scores lower than the UK. And this all matters because if we lose faith in our political institutions, in our leaders, in our processes, and the systems designed to hold all this to account, then we could end up in a situation where participation, engagement drops, and we all end up in a situation where we're like Brenda from Bristol. If any of you don't know, Brenda from Bristol was doorstepped when Theresa May announced the snap election, and she was asked how she felt about it, and she said, honestly, I can't stand it. She's an icon for our times. So maybe it's time we started to think about doing things a little bit differently. I mean, after all, if you think about it, our system of parliamentary democracy has remained largely unchanged for the past 200 years, while the world around us is absolutely unrecognisable. And the good thing is there are really tried and tested ways of doing things differently. So deliberative democracy, well, it has its roots in ancient Athens. And this guy, Pericles, in 436 BC said, ordinary citizens, to be clear, he did mean men, though occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of public matters. And that instead of being a stumbling block in the way of action, discussion is an indispensable preliminary to any wise action at all. And it's this sentiment that underpins deliberative democratic theory, that political decisions should be the result of fair and reasonable discussion among citizens. Now, this all gained traction in the 1980s, thanks to a number of theorists working in the space, including Jane Mansbridge, an American scholar who worked at the Kennedy School in Harvard, who popularized the notion of beyond adversary democracy and everyday talk, and why understanding that was crucial to good decision-making. There was also Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher and sociologist working in the same time, and they paved the way for Gastel and Levine's Deliberative Democracy Handbook, which was published in 2005. But while there were isolated cases of deliberative democracy in practice, it never really took off in contemporary politics or took hold in the popular imagination until now. And I think there are many reasons why it's the right time to be using these approaches again. The first is if you think about the wider political context, we're in a place which is characterized by political polarization, by apathy, by mistrust, by misinformation. There's also the fact that a lot of the issues our governments are working with are long-term. They outlast political cycles. If you think about things like the challenges posed by AI or the climate crisis, they're not going to be solved in any one electoral cycle. So we need new ways of achieving consensus and taking action, and deliberative processes are just one way of doing this.
She hands the baton. Ooh, yikes. But regardless of the actual approach, when we talk about deliberative processes, the most famous of these, or perhaps the most popularised at the moment, certainly in the UK context, is what Jane will speak to, and our citizens' assemblies. So a quick show of hands, just so we have some participation in the democracy chat. How many people have heard of a citizens' assembly? Yes, indeed. So you will obviously, or have most certainly heard of them. And what these sit within, and this graph attempts to demonstrate, is that they sit within a much wider range of formats that revolve around the basic principles of deliberation in terms of time, information, and good conditions. And they all have different considerations and benefits. These can be applied to salient, complex, and contested issues where public attitudes might not be very well evidenced, or when the way forward is not clear for policymakers. And these approaches are now finding use not just in policymaking, but also wider research and knowledge-making processes. But what all of these approaches have in common are three things, so debatably three things. The first is learning in deliberation, so participants having access to impartial and accessible evidence from multiple sources, and they should represent a diverse range of perspectives. They're also given time to discuss this with one another in good conditions, and whilst it's debatable amongst people who study this precisely what those good conditions are, they should include trained facilitators who can create an equitable, focused environment where participants can weigh options and exchange reasons. They also, and throughout the process, she's getting there, they're surveyed at different points in order to see whether there's opinion change across the piece. The second issue, which I think is common to deliberative processes, is representativeness. So effectively to mini-public or not to mini-public, which I think was Shakespeare, although I can't be sure. Representativeness is a core characteristic of most deliberative formats, and certainly for methods including citizens' assemblies. Here, participants, usually a minimum of 50 or so, must reflect a microcosm of the public in the setting or in the group that's affected by the issue under discussion. And this is typically achieved through sortition or through civic lottery. But diversity of who's in the room, or on Zoom, as we'll come to see, is key. The third issue is around impact. So any deliberation has to have a clear mandate, and those commissioning it, especially on the policy side, must agree to respond to the recommendations. But other deliberative processes should also aim to speak to power too. And of course, it's important to remember as well about the impact such processes have on the participants themselves. For instance, in an evaluation of the UK Climate Assembly, Involve found that among Assembly members, their concern about the climate crisis continued to rise at a faster and a higher rate than the public as a whole after their participation. So what this gives us, in terms of method, in terms of characteristics, is quite the toolkit of options to better weave deliberative ideals into public life and the wider democratic project. And whilst we of course know a lot about how they can work face-to-face, we also increasingly see them used online. Certainly as a necessity during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also increasingly as a mode that can be suitable and appropriate to do deliberation. And so what we also know in terms of deliberation beyond citizens' assemblies is a wide range of examples of how deliberation can operate in society and across different issues. And if you don't know about Participedia, whilst there are many good bringings together of deliberative projects, I would encourage you to look there. And these processes have been used to great effect. I'm not going to steal Jane's thunder to revisit citizens' assemblies, for example, but Ireland have held processes on constitutional reform, as Suzanne was saying, but also ageing, climate and drugs policy, which show us a gold standard for how to use these models to make tough decisions on which there is buy-in. There's also Scotland's Climate Assembly, which was run online because of COVID-19, which led to policy recommendations debated at COP26. And further afield, there's been, for example, the Débat National in France, and I don't speak French, obviously, and the COP26 Global Assembly, bringing together participants from all over the world to discuss solutions to the climate crisis. As with anything, they are not a silver bullet. And there are big issues that need to be worked through, including, these are just our three for a starter discussion. One is returning back to impact. So how can we as practitioners make sure that the recommendations that citizens spend their time on actually go somewhere? What is the political end game set up at the start and not the end of a process? What weight can be given to findings generated through these processes? The second is about how we scale up. And increasingly there's a conversation about institutionalization, which a lot of very intelligent and very hardworking people are committing themselves to. Some of these processes are costly, they're time-consuming. So what can we do to make them more accessible to a wider variety of commissioners and participants? And we've been doing our own experiments, Suzanne and I, with colleagues at Stanford, on this using AI facilitation, for instance. So there's lots of sort of innovative tracks that we can possibly look at in a bit more detail. And the third, by no means least, is around inclusion. What can we do to make sure that these processes really are for everyone? What does that mean, and what do we need it to mean in the context of deliberation and deliberative democracy? And I'd add a fourth to this, which is about what links and connections can be made or might be necessary between these processes, which necessarily only involve a certain number of people under certain conditions, to wider efforts in participatory democracy. How can they join forces? But while these questions remain, there's no doubt that these processes bring hope for how we fix the problems we have with democracy and show the public's very real appetite and enthusiasm for tackling the complex policy issues which affect them. So we're going to leave it there and at this point invite our panel. So Douglas, Jay, Miriam, if you would come and take your seats. And yeah, that's the setup from Suzanne and I, and we'll invite reflections now. So we've asked panellists to spend about 5 to 7 minutes sharing some initial reflections on this theme and some of what they've just heard. So Douglas, if I could invite you to begin.
Thank you, and thank you for both giving up your time this evening and allowing me to join such an esteemed panel. Rather at odds with this august academic setting, I thought I would start with a personal story. And I would like to take you back to the last time I held elected office, which was in the autumn of 2014. As many of you would have known, we had a referendum on independence in Scotland. It had an unprecedented level of participation. About 84.7% of the Scottish electorate chose to vote in the referendum on September the 18th of 2014. And about a couple of months after that incredibly energising but divisive referendum, I'm sitting like this, but behind a small desk in the Johnson's supermarket in Morrison's in my then constituency. And a woman comes up to me and says, "I am never voting for you again." So it wasn't the most auspicious start to the conversation. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Why is that?" And she said, "You let us down on the referendum." And I said, "Well, I appreciate we were on different sides of the referendum, but would we not both agree that Scotland's now made our decisions, so we should come together and move forward?" And she said, "That's not the decision that Scotland made." And at that point, I gave up any forlorn hope of her vote and thought I would just pursue the conversation. So I said, "Do you think it was a conspiracy?" And she says, "Well, yes, actually, I do. Everybody I know voted yes." And I said, "Okay, help me with this." I said, "The Scottish Government published its prospectus for independence, and it said that the oil price would never fall below $114 a barrel. And I happened to hear on Radio Scotland this morning that Brent crude is trading at about $35 a barrel. Now, that's a price set internationally. How do you explain that?" I'm not having a go, I just want to understand. "How would you explain that?" "That's a conspiracy too," she said. And I said, who's that a conspiracy by?" And she said, "That's a conspiracy by the oil companies." And I said, "But surely if the oil companies were conspiring on the price, they would conspire to keep the price high, because then they would make more profits rather than low." She said, no, it's a conspiracy." And I said, "Do you mind if I ask, where do you get your news?" And she said, "I get my news off Facebook every night." And I said, "Do you mind if I ask, what do you do?" And she said, "I'm a senior social work manager with the City of Glasgow Council." And then she took her shopping and she moved on. And I sat behind that desk and I thought, I just don't know how to do politics any longer, because all the democracy that I've experienced has to have certain shared facts. And if you don't have shared facts, you can diverge in opinions, but if you have shared facts, you've got some basis by which to move forward. I sat there thinking, I just don't know how to do this. It was proved that I didn't know how to do it a few months later when I lost my seat. And I really then thought about it, and I thought I probably have two core convictions that I want to test. One is that the best antidote to fake news are real relationships. And actually, there's something there about the integrity of the conversation and real relationships. And secondly, democracy has to be about more than the way that we vote. It has to be about the way that we think as well. And I had the great privilege of the BBC being willing to support me in making a radio series about how we could deliberate together, and in particular, how we could disagree better. Because I place a great weight on civility in our debates, but if you don't have the scope for division and difference in a democratic society, that's a recipe for stagnation and injustice. There are circumstances where to disagree is actually a healthy and important democratic impulse. And in that sense, Jane, honestly, it was my encounters and experience in Ireland that was transformational to my thinking about deliberative democracy, because I was able to meet with a whole number of people who had participated in the Citizens' Assembly there, particularly the one on abortion. And it struck me that we had so much to learn here in the UK from our near neighbours in Ireland. And I suppose as somebody who had been a practicing politician and therefore had spent time in Parliament, the key lesson that I drew, not just in terms of how it was facilitated, I remember meeting this fabulous single mother who said to me, I got a letter through the post inviting me to the Citizens' Assembly. It said it would take place, I think, over 3 weekends in a hotel. She said I would have walked across hot coals to get away from my kids and to have a weekend, all expenses paid 3 times to talk about anything. But the fact is, When she then described the process and other participants described the process, what I realised was that it is so profoundly different from let's just get the public together and there'll be a wisdom of the crowd. There's a very structured and deliberative process whereby a function that I think our politicians have lost, which is the capacity to be the broker across difference, is re-established in deliberative democracy. And in that sense, truthfully, for me, it was making that radio series about how to deliberate better together that convinced me that there's a critical role for deliberative democracy here in the UK. Now, of course, we've seen initiatives from the UK Parliament. 6 select committees got together and have initiated citizens' assemblies here in the UK. As I recollect it, the idea originally came from Canada. Both Ontario and British Columbia had initiated citizens' assemblies. But it feels to me, and I say this in a personal capacity, that we are at the foothills in the UK of understanding the true potential of deliberative democracy to try and heal some of the brokenness that were so obvious in those slides and so obviously are felt by a wide share of the British public at this stage. Probably enough to start.
That's great. Thank you, Douglas. Jane?
I'm actually going to respond a little bit. I'm not sure, do people know a lot about the Irish Citizens' Assembly, or will I spend a minute, hands up for spend a minute telling you about it? Okay. So yeah, back in 2008, 2009, we had the Great Recession, obviously, the banking collapse and so on. And Ireland was one of the worst affected. Was part of the PEGs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece and Spain, where the IMF and the World Bank had to come in. Trust in government went way down. People lost jobs, people had pay cuts, there were protests. It was a very difficult time. And a group of us have been thinking about deliberative democracy because, as Douglas says, we'd looked at what had happened in British Columbia and Ontario, where they'd had citizens' assemblies looking at electoral reform. And those had worked really well, but they'd actually gone on to lose the ensuing referendums, partly because they weren't organised to include politicians, include the political class. They were, organised to be very pure kind of exercises with just people. So we had a group called We the Citizens, I referred to earlier, where we got philanthropic funding, and we brought 100 randomly selected people. So that's the really important point of a citizen assembly, is that the people are randomly selected. We had people there who'd never voted, people who were unemployed, people who were retired school teachers, who were the usual suspects that one would expect to volunteer for this kind of thing. And we brought them together and we got them to actually think about austerity at the time. So what's the balance between tax and spending? This was clearly a really salient issue in 2011 in Ireland. And the really surprising thing was that they listened to economists from the right and from the left, from the trade unions, from the business organisations, from different universities, but they were able to come up with trade-offs. So they were actually willing to pay some more taxes in some areas, for example, on water and so on. There's no water charges in Ireland. But they wanted educational spending ring-fenced and health spending ring-fenced. So they were able to look at different kind of options and deliberate with each other. And I think this really helped because before this, when we'd been advocating for it in newspapers and so on, people would always say, oh, we already have a citizen assembly, it's called the Parliament. Or, you'll only get the Green Biro Brigade who are going to come and, just insist on their own things and not be able to compromise and listen to other people. So as a result, the government had very little it could actually do. The IMF was running fiscal policy. So one thing they could do was actually push deliberative democracy into the manifestos. And as a result, in 2012, the Constitutional Convention came about. And its first thing that it looked at was actually an issue that was dividing the coalition at the time, which was marriage equality. And there were politicians in the room. So there were 66 citizens and 33 politicians who were there, I think, because they didn't particularly trust the process. They wanted to see what it would look like. And that assembly advocated for a referendum on marriage equality and advocated for a yes vote in that referendum. And afterwards, the research that we did, the government went along with the Citizens' Assembly recommendation, because one of the things about it is that it's great, like everybody in the room, when you do evaluations of a Citizens' Assembly, all 100 people, or at least 98 out of the 100, love it, you know. So, oh, I've never been asked for my opinion before, you know, especially older women would say that, you know, never even by my husband, and, you know, this kind of thing. But the important thing is how it actually translates out first to the political class, then to the media, and then to the general population. And so the politicians were able to use it to get over this kind of issue where they had big divisions between themselves. So it was very good in terms of those sort of inter-party differences, and indeed intra-party differences, because, you know, the bigger party had conservative members and more liberal members, and they couldn't decide on what way to go on marriage equality, for example. And so the referendum came about, and the research showed that people who were aware of the aware of the Citizens' Assembly and aware of the evidence that came from it, they were more likely to vote in favour, and they'd higher levels of knowledge about it. So this was one of the first times we saw this kind of jump to, well, how does the Citizen Assembly actually feed into the wider public rather than just impacting the 66 or the 100 people in the room. So the next coalition had a huge difficulty with abortion. Ireland had had an absolute ban on abortion. It was kind of somewhere close to Iran at the time. And, you know, activists have been trying to do something about it for 30 years and more. But one of the members of the new government insisted, as her price for going in, that there would have to be a Citizen Assembly on abortion. And so that happened. And again, the Citizen Assembly, and we found this, they tend towards kind of more liberal policies often, but more reflective ones, more perspective taking, where they think about other people's point of view and so on. So that Citizen Assembly recommended another referendum on abortion and to vote in favour of it. This time, the process went into a parliamentary committee who debated it, looked at much of the same evidence, the same experts and so on and so forth, and came to broadly the same but slightly more conservative proposals. And again, there was a referendum. But the interesting thing was that the number of people who voted yes in the referendum was very similar to the number of people who had voted yes in the Citizen Assembly, because there'd been concerns that the Assembly might have been stacked with more liberal people than the population as a whole, and therefore the recommendations couldn't possibly reflect the people. But in fact, what we found was that the media narrative, which tends towards media logics to yes and no and kind of very simplistic answers, didn't actually reflect what people in the country as a whole thought, rather than what activists on both sides thought. The same one had a climate change debate. And again, it allowed the government, which had always been, we were an extreme climate change laggard, we're still a laggard, but not quite as extreme, to follow Westminster, which had actually voted to declare a climate emergency. So our Parliament was able to follow Westminster and declare the same thing, which was interesting. So since then, we've had other ones. So we have them on gender equality. There's referendums this September on local government, on biodiversity. That's going into a special parliamentary committee at the moment. And then there's one that's currently running, which is on drugs policy and legalisation and that kind of thing. So it'll be really interesting to see where that goes. So it's just really interesting looking at, you know, how you embed it, how you institutionalise it and so on. Mm-hmm. It's how we were talking, how you get it into the political class, the importance of building those links, which the Canadians didn't. All of the politicians campaigned against the referendums in Canada because they weren't included in the process in any way. And then how to think about actually using what's going on in it in order to reach out to the wider public so they actually become part of ordinary discourse and life.
Perfect. Thank you, Jane. And a series of extremely interesting examples for us to chew over a bit more. Miriam, please.
Thanks. When the health ministers and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet sit around and make these decisions that's going to be impacting everybody in the country, this privileged group of people sat around the table. Where's Mr. Ordinary? Where's Mrs. Ordinary? Now, that's not me speaking, that's Harry. Harry was one of our members of our People's Panel, the Citizens' Assembly that we ran at Engage Britain, which was tasking the members to determine which of all the many things going wrong in the NHS and social care system should be prioritised first. And basically, Harry summed it up much better than I think any of us could do. What Kerry and Suzanne kind of set out at the beginning was kind of all the problems, right? All the things that are going wrong, all the lack of trust in politics, the lack of trust in politicians and the media and our institutions, how disenfranchised and disempowered people feel. We know what the problem is. Like, this is a problem. We can all feel it. I can feel it in my bones. The question is, what do we do about it? It's one of the most inspiring things, actually, hearing from Jane about what happened in Ireland. I'm massively jealous, I have to say, in England, that we've never, ever come even slightly close to what Ireland have done, or Scotland, actually, for that matter. We're really far behind in England. But I think there's some really exciting things happening in the democracy sector in the UK. And I think there's some choices to make about kind of how we approach this and kind of how we tackle some of these problems that we've been talking about. You can take the view that representative democracy has had its time. Blow it all up, blow up the system. Not literally, not Guy Fawkes. But you could start again. Have a new model of citizen-led participation. Or you can work within the existing model and try and make it work better now. You can focus on a single issue, like reform of the House of Lords or electoral reform, or you can focus on systems change, kind of try to change kind of much bigger structural issues within the system. I think it's really exciting, actually, what's happening in the democracy sector, because there is kind of this spectrum of kind of a plurality of different approaches that we're all taking, but all pushing in the same direction, trying to kind of show that there are different models for change. And within that spectrum, where Engage Britain sits in that mix is that we think that we don't have time to wait for the whole system to be changed for something better. I think there probably is the ability to do something better, but we haven't got time for that. We have to start trying to turn the tanker of the political establishment now, because it's going to take some time. And we're just going to have to start that movement now and show that things can be done differently. Because the alternative, the rise of illiberal democracy and populist authoritarians, feels like a very real threat. I feel it kind of coming, it could come down that track, and I think if it's coming, it's going to come pretty fast. So I think we need the alternatives now. So what Engage Britain does is that we're here to try and show that there is a different way of doing politics. We're founded on this really, really simple idea, the one that we've been talking about kind of all evening, which is kind of actually the people impacted by a policy should be in the room when decisions are taken on it. They've got to be part, we've got to be part of the solutions that are to the challenges that are facing our country. We need a democracy that's going to spread power way beyond a small handful of buildings in Westminster and Holyrood and Cardiff, kind of across Britain, one which uses the collective intelligence of the whole population to be able to kind of reach better decisions. What I really think is the foundations of democracy are going to be so much stronger if people have a role in the political and public decisions that affect their lives. Not everybody being involved in every decision. God, no, that would take forever. And you can imagine how boring the committees would be and the bureaucracy that would entail. Not that. But just like what we've been talking about, kind of that representativeness, that kind of the representatives of the different perspectives of people who are living and breathing the issues that we're talking about all the time. We know what the problems are. The people at the sharp end of the stuff, we know what the problems are, we know the questions to ask, and actually most people have got some really good ideas about what the solutions might be, but they're never asked their opinion, they're never asked for their ideas and their insights. What we think is better is coming up with solutions that work for the common good, and that's going to be done in a way that is very different to closed, usual, kind of business as usual, kind of Whitehall processes that tend to have, as a rule, and I've worked in government and I've seen it kind of up close, kind of have minimal diversity of perspectives and very little or no experience from the front line kind of in the room when these decisions are made. So to involve people, citizen assemblies, definitely yes. I think these are like this beautiful, simple, wonderful way of bringing people into the room to kind of look at these really difficult trade-offs. I also think we need more than that. I think on any given issue, if we're going to come up with good solutions that brings together all the people impacted by that issue, and that means the public, it means those working on the front line, it means managers, it means the decision makers, it means the policy makers, it means the experts, It's actually the dialogue between all of those different groups and different perspectives that allows the collective to come up with solutions that are going to work kind of across the whole system. So, as an example, what we've done at Engage Britain is that, as you said at the beginning, we took kind of the hardest questions, one of the biggest challenges facing the country at the moment, which is around how can we make sure that everybody gets the health and care that they need. And what we wanted to do was show, yeah, it's possible to kind of build a kind of policy solutions to that really big question from the grassroots up. So we started with 101 community conversations, and that brought groups of people across the country together to share with each other, talk about kind of what works really well in the health and care systems now, and mostly what they talk about, what doesn't work really well. Unsurprisingly, we heard hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories about things that are going wrong. You can see all the first-person stories kind of on our website, like there's people talking about these really difficult experiences they've had. So we knew that you can't possibly tackle all of these issues at the same time. So what we did is that we put the public's stories in front of a citizens' assembly, our people's panel. We gave them 4 weekends to work out, okay, of all of these things going wrong, what are the priorities? What should we tackle first? So they heard from public, they heard from experts, and they deliberated on that. And then what we did, they took their top 2 issues, and we said, right, thank you. You've done an amazing job. You've said these 2 issues are the like, most important. One of them, what everyone would expect, is about staffing, not enough health and social care staff to meet current and future needs. And the second top priority, second priority was around how poorly the NHS communicates with patients and the needless harm that causes, which was really interesting because actually that was something that could only have come out of deliberation. It's nowhere near the political agenda. It's nowhere near what the NHS is really talking about. And yet that's what bothers people more than all of these other issues. But what we did, we took those top 2 issues and we used co-design. We brought different people into the room to work out, well, what do you do about it? It's not enough to just identify the problem. What are we going to do about it? So on the social care staffing, we brought together people who draw on social care, people who work on the front line, care workers, we brought care providers, we brought people who commission and run adult social services, we brought policy experts, brought this group together over 8 sessions, over 6 months, and basically tasked them with like, okay, what's going to work for all of you? What are those solutions that are not going to work just for one bit of the system, but for all of your bits that are really going to make a positive difference? And they were brilliant, like brilliant, this group of people. They put together a policy package which covered everything from like relatively simple quick wins, like actually every frontline care worker who goes into people's homes should have a green badge, a parking permit that means that they can park for free outside people's homes, because parking's a nightmare. It's like, it's brilliant. Yes, okay. Amazing. And they came up with structural changes like pay parity with the NHS and a long-term funded 10-year workforce plan. What was so exciting is that they could come up with solutions that would work across the system, both practically and financially, for all of those different parts. And if you just have one bit of the kind of the answer, one perspective in the room, you don't get those answers that could actually make a difference. But for us, running those sort of projects isn't enough. What we're really keen to do is just do more, to make a noise about what needs to change in the way that politics is done. And the way that I think change is going to happen is if you have both top-down and bottom-up change. You can't have just one or the other. What I mean by that is that you have to have the push from the grassroots. You have to have people who want to be more involved in decision-making. But I think people are there. Like there was a really interesting survey, report done by the UCL's Constitution Unit on democracy that showed that 77% of people think that people like them have too little influence on the way the UK is governed. So we know there's appetite. We know people want this. Alongside that push from the grassroots, you have to have top-down change. You have to have the people with the power opening up the doors and creating the opportunities for people to get involved. Because otherwise, you're just going to have a load of really angry people outside shouting at politicians and people with the power who are sitting inside the room with their fingers in the ears. And that's not going to change anything. So what I think we need to do is we have to find the politicians, looking only a little bit over here, find politicians who are open to finding new ways of engaging with their electorate, because it's in their interest to do so. We have to find people, and those politicians who want to involve people, to find a way through the massive challenges facing our country, the ones that do go beyond the electoral cycles of every 4 years, these longitudinal problems that just can't be fixed in 4 years or 5 years. Those who are interested in solutions that the public will get behind, so what you can build consensus around. And I have no doubt there are politicians out there who are really interested in that. But in the meantime, what we're doing at Engage Britain and others in the democracy sector is doing is showing that it is possible to do democracy differently. We think that before major policy decisions are made, before new legislation is made, people with different expertise and experience are brought together, and that they work through kind of some of the solutions and some of the issues that are going to work practically and financially for all parts of the system. I think the last thing that I wanted to say is that the question about democracy being in trouble because the public don't trust politicians is the wrong way round. Actually, I think the far greater problem is that politicians don't trust the people, and that's the thing we have to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we get into questions, just to say, if anyone's standing, there's 3 seats in the front, so if you're tired, I know a front row seat is never always the most appealing, but we're not going to be picking people out for questions, so if anyone wants to sit down, do come down. But just before we get into questions from the audience, Kerry and I are going to abuse our position as chairs a little bit and just ask some of our own questions, if that's okay. And Douglas, I wanted to turn to you first, if that's all right, and just pick up on something Miriam was saying about how it's going to be important that people in power open up the doors to others. And it's great that you're convinced and you're an advocate for these approaches, but I wonder what's the appetite in Westminster for these kind of approaches?
I wouldn't presume to speak for Westminster, thankfully, but my sense is there's an overwhelming sense that politics is broken. And if politicians don't hear that or listen to that, they're not going to be politicians very long. And in that sense, I think that exactly as Miriam says, the great social movements start with the public and end with the politicians, not the other way around. And my sense is there is a profound yearning in our country for a different and a better way to share and live our common life. Because ultimately, politics is about how we live well together. How many of us in this room or in this country feel that our politics is a high calling inviting us to live well together at the moment? Nobody. And the reality is there is so much that we need to do that not just the destination of politics, but the how of politics, I think, is in play in a way it hasn't been for a long time. Now, a couple of caveats to that. One is, my sense is that the central currency of British politics for the last 10 years has really been culture, and it's about to be and being usurped by economics. So I would not for a moment suggest that most of the conversations I'm having on doorsteps in East Lothian are exclusively about the reform of the House of Lords. It's about how do you pay your gas bill. So in that sense, economics seems to me to be roaring back centre stage. That's one point that I think is important. And the second point is, I think even within the democracy movement, there needs to be humility in saying, this is not a silver bullet. It is critically important, and what I'm saying in no way undermines my own enthusiasm, but we've got so many problems in British democracy at the moment that I think we need silver buckshot, not silver bullet. And if you like, part of that answer is citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, and opening those doors, whether in Whitehall, whether in government, or indeed whether in Parliament, a lot more widely than they've been opened at the moment. So I think economics is going to be centre stage in the next election and to our public life in the years ahead. But I think we need to make sure that doesn't crowd out, if you like, the urgent doesn't crowd out other important issues, which is the how of how we live together and how we do politics better.
Thank you. And Jane, the next question is for you. So obviously we've heard about a series of ways in which citizens' assemblies have been effective and the way they're studied and understood and evaluated. But where do you think we might need to go next in academia, in practice, if we want to ensure that these ideas continue to grow and develop their impact?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, I was looking at the evaluation of the Global Assembly, and you have the Irish one, the different ones in England and elsewhere. I think the biggest thing is actually that connection between what's called the mini public in the Citizen Assembly and the wider public, and trying to build and understanding how you can build and what are the limitations and where does it work and what are the methods. But to build those links, you know, like we all know, for example, that the jury system is somewhat imperfect, but yet the jury system has a high degree of legitimacy. So how do you actually build that legitimacy? One of the things I'm struck by in England is the very low trust in the press. And, you know, like obviously the tabloid press and where it is and some of the other press is problematic for some parts because there's more, it's more politically charged and there's not going to be the same kind of reporting as there might be in other countries such as Canada or Ireland or even in Scotland, which got very good coverage. You know, the Westminster Assembly here that the committees targeted actually got relatively little press other than the report of David Attenborough at the first weekend. So I think, you know, we need to look at how those connections are and how they kind of go out across different sort of media platforms, how social media is used, how conversations are used. Some of our universities have started using deliberation to listen to citizens' voices within changes in the universities. So students are getting to understand about it more. There's issues around kind of information literacy and libraries. So there's people who are going in and working in libraries, which are often used by older people as well, and just understanding it. So I think it's about understanding, you know, the importance of building those linkages, because I think you can have as many citizen juries or, you know, online deliberations or anything as you want, but if people don't know about them, if they don't believe that they're legitimate, and if they don't trust them, then that's going to be really difficult. And in terms of Ireland, like it's the next one is theoretically it's been proposed that it might be about neutrality, and there's another one which people are talking about which might be about the border. These are two really, really highly contentious, highly politicized issues that I think will really test the model. Yeah, so, you know, at the moment, it's like it's no panacea. Like it's not like Ireland isn't up at kind of finished levels of trust in government or media or anything. You know, we are not Scandinavian, so it's certainly not a silver bullet, but it is kind of one piece of the jigsaw that can help. So I think those are some of the bigger challenges.
Thank you. Thank you. And final question from us before we hand over to you in the audience. So do get thinking about what you'd like to ask our brilliant panel. But Miriam, I just want to come to you. You mentioned in your presentation, these aren't methods for every policy decision. That would be too much. But I wondered, what are the big policy issues that these approaches should be applied to and why?
Where to start? So, to be honest, it is hard to think of a policy area where it wouldn't be really useful. I'd say it's the issues where it would be really useful, helpful, and good for the country to bring kind of citizens into that discussion would be ones where there's hard trade-offs to be made, like hard or ethical issues that we need to unpick. An issue that the public really cares about, I'll probably start there. Like, interestingly, they really care about, people tell us they really care about the NHS. And I'm guessing this audience really cares about democratic reform. But most people out there don't put it terribly highly up on their list, but they do put things like the NHS, poverty, immigration, very, very high up the things they really care about. So the issues that have political salience, because what you need is a landing zone for this stuff. It needs to be something that politicians know they have to tackle, but haven't done it yet, haven't cracked it. It's too difficult, too contentious, too heated to kind of strip, to kind of actually take on. I mean, if you take something like immigration, questions that have a really technical answer, like actually how should the Home Office be processing all the claims that come in? Citizens really probably shouldn't go there. The technical question is not really one I don't know. You're not very likely to know how to do that sort of thing. But if you bring people together to look at what a kind of humane, fair, balanced immigration system looks like that actually balances the needs of people who live here now and people who want to come into the country, that's a question that we can take on. Absolutely. If you bring kind of people who live across the UK with kind of a variety of perspective on kind of liberal / authoritarian kind of spectrum of opinion, plus recent immigrants and immigrants who've been here for like some time, for generations, bring them together with the people who've actually got to implement the policy, and you're going to come up with something that's really interesting that takes some of the political heat out of that debate. So yeah, I'd say an issue like that would be exceptionally interesting.
Yeah, and the way you ask the question matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. All right, so we're now opening up to the floor. So yes, and obviously lots of people who want to ask questions. So we might take 2 or 3 at a time, and obviously the panel are invited to respond where they feel they can or have something to add. So if we start on the right-hand side, lady with the dark round glasses.
Thanks very much. I want to start where Douglas Alexander started, which is about digital platforms being part of the problem, and ask the panel to say a little bit about digital democracy being part of the solution. And the poster person example is Audrey Tang in Taiwan, who's a digital minister. And if you don't know anything about Audrey, look them up. And over the last few years, more than half of the population of Taiwan, around 25 million, half of the 25 million, have engaged on those platforms, pitching in ideas about policies, areas of concern, how to design policies, as well as being asked to vote on different systems. So I'd be very keen to have the panel's view on that.
Thank you. Could you just say where you're from and your name as well, if you don't mind?
University of Cambridge. Yep.
Lovely, thank you. Okay.
Sorry, my name, Teresa Mate. I'm a behavioural scientist.
Thank you. Okay, so if we could take at the back with the white shirt, black jacket.
Thanks very much. Really fascinating panel. And I'm with Miriam. I think James' examples are just extraordinary. My name's Trevor. I'm from an organisation called Culture Commons, where we design policy for the creative and cultural, to support the creative and cultural life of the UK. I think culture, actually, and how we identify is a really important part of this, which is often not part of the discussion. But my conversation is actually, question, sorry, is about devolution. I think part of the problem in the UK, and in particular in England, is that we don't really have a culture of decision-making locally. So local leaders are increasingly getting new powers. And I just wonder, what is the intersection here? I mean, the oases that are being created by these deliberative democratic exercises are really exciting, but day-to-day lived experience of people in their everyday communities, they don't feel that connection to decision-making locally. So I guess the question is, what does the panel feel like the sort of devolution revolution that's taking place might add to this agenda, and could that be something that we all need to support a bit more?
Thank you. Okay, let's just take one more. So yeah, tap in with the maroon jumper in the front. It could be burgundy, who knows. Did I got it, okay, second try. Yeah.
It's definitely burgundy.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you. Apologies to Douglas, but I was really taken with Jane and Miriam's examples. Having lived over in the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland during the 80s, I know exactly how important the issue of cross-border communication and understanding is. But I have a really wonky question. Having participated and even helped organise some focus groups in the past, I'm just wondering what. I'm sure a lot of people here will know what a focus group is. I'm just wondering if both Jane and Miriam could perhaps comment on what are the main differences organisationally for putting together a deliberative group citizens assembly, because focus groups tend to be quite easy to hijack. We've had a couple of examples in the past of people who are known to be going from focus group to try and influence them. And that was something that was quite a surprise to me. People with more experience sort of knew who to look for, but I was completely taken aback by it. So I'm just wondering, from an organisational point of view, what are the main differences are, and how do you vouchsafe them from being abused? Thank you.
Say who you are. Just say who you are.
My name's Gerard. I organise a political discussion group in London. We tack into the most difficult topics that you could imagine. The tagline is, we talk about what you can't talk about at work. It's londonidw.org, so you can go and look us up.
Thank you for that. Okay, so digital democracy, devolution, and organisational differences between focus group and deliberation. Who'd like to have a go at any of those? You can start anywhere.
I'll happily talk a bit about devolution. I think democratic literacy and political literacy should start like close to home, should start at school, and that means starting really local and going all the way up to the national. It's like, I completely agree with you that people feel disengaged from the decision-making that happens. But actually, I think people are probably closer to the decision that's made by their local authority, closer than they are to national decisions that are made on a national scale. Because you tend to know, most people have an idea, kind of, like at least what flavour of kind of local authority they have, maybe their local councillor, and it seems a little bit easier to engage. But can you take some of the decisions that local authorities are responsible for and like devolve those down to like people? Absolutely, yes. And actually what I think is quite exciting is some of the more innovative ways of doing deliberative democracy is happening at local authority level, in fact much, much more so than it's happening at national level. I mean, you can look at planning, you can look at some transport issues, you can look at revitalisation of city centres, like all of those sort of things, involving people in those sort of processes. And when I was in government, we did do some of that with local authorities. I think that is the only way you're going to get change, actually, is if you kind of build that literacy from a very local level and then it kind of translates upwards. But like I said before, the change also needs to come from the top. You have to be able to see that being replicated at national government level as well. I'll stop there because somebody else probably want to jump in.
Well, I can talk to the last one, if you like, then, about the differences between focus groups. It's actually interesting because one of the things that politicians especially, or people who are very sceptical will say, well, it's just like a big focus group. So it's just like taking the temperature of what it is that people think. But of course, the key difference is that if you're doing a focus group, you get people who come along, they've thought about things, but you don't necessarily present them with a lot of new evidence. You certainly don't go out of your way to present them with balanced evidence from both sides of the argument. And then the other thing is that, so we, in the Irish Citizen Assembly, you would get academic evidence. Normally, you know, everybody has to redo their slides at least once to make it understandable. But then you also have the both sides of the argument. So, for example, the advocates and the opponents in civil society. So on abortion, for example, we'd have had a long table where you'd have had Amnesty International at one end of the table, and at the other end of the table were the Knights of Columbanus and the Opus Dei. Yeah, just talking about like what their issues were, and then people with lived experience as well, because of course everybody has different learning styles. So some people learn and can understand stories better than abstract academic arguments and so on. So you try to give them a broad range of all of that. And then the other important thing is that of course it's facilitated. So you don't get the person dominating. You have a good facilitator who tries to make sure there's some sort of equality of speaking time. And then of course that they're randomly selected. So you can't have those people who would be the people who would always turn up to something. You know, if you have it, our very first one, we went around the country and we asked people to turn up, and they were mostly retired teachers and civil servants, you know, but you don't get that many retired teachers and civil servants into a randomly selected assembly, so that makes it different.
Just to add to that as well, there's an organisation in Australia called New Democracy run by Ian Walker, and they've done a lot of work into the invitation process, because the initial invite goes out to tens of thousands of people, and they've done so much work because it's got to, when it lands on your doormat, it's got to look like something you want to do. It looks like a proper invitation, and you know, they've done all sorts of work about what weight of paper, what font, what colour. How do you make that a moment where people feel that they're about to participate in something that actually matters? It's very different from, you know, when I started in qualitative research, your recruiter was the person with the clipboard on the street that you would cross the road to avoid to make sure you didn't get stopped by them. But yeah, Douglas, I wonder if there's anything you wanted to comment on.
Yes, I sense, like most of us in this room, I agree with Jane. In the sense that, I mean, listen, I was of the new Labour generation, so we did a lot of focus groups, a lot. Some would say too many. But we really used them for two things. One was a kind of dipstick test of the national conversation. What are people talking about at the moment? And are people hearing what we think we're saying? So people would say test language. But there was no sense that those members of those focus groups, who in some ways were incredibly powerful, actually went on a journey as part of the process. And one of my key learnings from spending time with colleagues in Ireland is the extent to which people develop their own thinking while encountering these experts, these advocates, these campaigning groups in a highly structured process over a number of weeks, but in a trusted setting in which they believed in the integrity of the process. And that's very different from a kind of sheep dip of public opinion, if you like, in terms of focus groups. On the digital platform point and the devolution revolution, I've got two thoughts that in some ways bring those questions together. One is, one of the things that, and I'm a big supporter of devolution, one of the things that makes devolution hard is Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives back in the 80s in the United States. He was a congressional representative for Cambridge, Massachusetts, and his great phrase was, all politics is local. I was at a conference with colleagues from the States relatively recently, and someone produced their smartphone, and they said, the real problem with American democracy today is that all politics is national because of these things, and held up their phone. So if you're running for dog catcher in rural Iowa, the first question is not generally, are you any good at catching dogs? It's, are you a spear carrier for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump? And so we need to recognize that the virtual space is where a lot of politics now happens. And when I made the tentative step to step back into public life, I've been very interested in terms of what's fundamentally shifted in the last 8 years. And an awful lot of politics happens online in the digital space today. The era of public meetings is a bygone phenomenon in many parts of the country. But that's not altogether a healthy phenomenon, in the sense that the level of abuse, the level of absolutism that people can adopt, often behind the veil of anonymity online, is fundamentally different from the up-close and personal nature of democracy at its best. And in that sense, I think Audrey Tang, to be honest, is a fabulous counterexample to that. I discovered Audrey Tang during the pandemic. One of the lines that was offered by the Taiwanese government is that humor is more powerful than rumor. So when there were rumors spreading about the pandemic, they produced extraordinary online content, but they had a digital minister who was a digital native and understood it 1,000 times better than anybody I could see communicating on behalf of the UK government. But unless you've got somebody that skilled in the digital space, my worry is that it is often distractive and destructive more than it builds our sense of common life. And I think we haven't really got our heads around how effectively to deploy the same kind of tools we're talking about this evening in the online space. And if we think that's a challenge in relation to social media, as you mentioned, AI is about to have a real-time experiment in elections in 2024 in the United States and here in the United Kingdom. And we haven't begun to figure out quite how profound the effect of AI could be on any sense of shared facts, common experience, and our broader common life.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more round of questions. We started a little bit late. Okay, so chap at the front and the left with the round glasses. We'll start with you. Sorry, you can do some picking if you want.
Thank you. I'm Christian Jaramillo from LSE, from a student from LSE, and there's a lot of talk, and we have been talking about the perceptions of citizens with democracy. But what about politicians with democracy? Because in the last years, we have seen politicians and political parties contesting electoral process and electoral institutions, like the United States and the GOP, Bolsonaro and Brazil, that led ultimately with the Bolsonaro ban to participate in the next elections. Peru, for example, is another example of politicians contesting democratic institutions. So is there any data regarding the trust that British politician has with democracy, and how we can involve MPs and other representatives with to strengthen their democratic compromise?
Thank you. Awesome. And then, yeah, chap in the middle with the black leather jacket. or not quite the middle, but she's doing well. She's doing well.
Thank you very much. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst. I identified Wagnerism, as in the Wagner Group, 25 years ago. So I'm used to certain issues growing and being ignored until things explode, in this case, literally. My question is, a bit following on from Professor Suter's point, you all referred to it in ways, is what about the really awkward stuff? How do you deal with that? Is it on the agenda or is it kept off the agenda? And we all know that there are certain things that have been kept off agendas. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, 2 more? Yeah. So, well, you guys can fight it out. Because you're sat next to each other. Oh, no, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Sorry.
I'm involved in a website called Wikipedia, and I'm just wondering, smaller questions for Suzanne and Kerry.
Okay, back.
Have you looked at the deliberative ways in which, say, Wikipedia runs itself as a way of, and I suppose also for Gary, as a way of a self-organisation, a group of people self-organising and a deliberative form of making some sometimes quite contentious decisions.
Lovely, thank you. And sorry, chap behind you in the light blue shirt.
Thank you. I think my question follows on quite nicely from the previous gentleman's one. It's about experts. So how much do experts sort of hold the key in this discussion, I suppose? And we're quite used to seeing experts on our screens in the past few years, you know, Chris Whitty at the pandemic, and Liz Truss trying to sort of legitimize her policies with expert advice. So how can we sort of support experts in this discussion, especially whenever people are putting their weight behind expert opinion in the survey that I just read and flicked through? My name's Austin. I'm from a consultancy called Atalanta.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so 4 questions there. What about the perceptions of politicians? How do we support experts, or do experts kind of hold the key, and how can they be supported to engage? And what about the really awkward stuff? That's the title of a blog post. And then something about the ways in which kind of Wikipedia and other platforms which exist in that kind of social media space do or do not kind of reflect deliberative principles and what that might mean. Again, kind of open in terms of anyone who might want to pick one of those. Any resonate?
I'll go quickly just on the last point. Speaking personally, I have not had enough of experts in this country. And I think that was evidenced in the pandemic and in other instances. One of the things I found very attractive about the citizens' assemblies was the extent to which it incorporated and gave a place to expertise, but in the context of a process that had a legitimacy, in the sense that part of that journey that the participants went on was being provided with expert opinion and advice. And again, a huge amount of work from Jane and colleagues went in to making sure that expert opinion was shared in an accessible way for participants. So too many academic papers are written in a way to guarantee that nobody reads them other than the people cited in the footnotes. It wasn't those kind of experts, it was experts who had a facility for communication, and we saw that in Scotland with the Climate Assembly as well, where they really worked very hard online to find experts who were able to communicate effectively. So I do think that that was a contributory factor to finding that common ground, and I think there's got some powerful lessons there more broadly for our politics.
I can talk about the awkward stuff, if you like. So it was interesting last week in Ireland. There's obviously a discussion going on in Ireland, as there is across much of Europe, around neutrality, around what it means about cooperating with NATO, around underseas cables, around all of this kind of thing. And the Prime Minister had said, oh, we'll have a citizens' assembly about it, but there's kind of a backlog, and it'll be quite some time before that would happen. And so instead, the Department of Foreign Affairs had a sort of a public consultation last week about it. But there were a lot of people who have always campaigned and always felt very strongly about peace and, you know, about not contributing militarily and so on. So a lot of the the agenda was actually taken up with people who were asking questions about what actually wasn't being presented at the public consultation, at the big event. And it was interesting because there were people there from the Helsinki Hybrid Centre and so on, and they were saying, they'd never actually been to such an open debate about these kind of very contentious issues. But nonetheless, the main criticism from the peace activists was actually that it wasn't a citizen assembly. So these people were self-selected largely who went in. The expertise was decided by the Department of Foreign Affairs, and there was a variety of it, but it wasn't as scientifically done. There weren't the advocates on both sides, there weren't the citizens and so on. So it's actually interesting that choosing to do a really contentious subject not through a citizen assembly in Dublin just last week actually proved to be more contentious than the really contentious citizens assemblies on things like abortion, which had been the subject of very divisive national debate for decades.
Miriam, do you have a minute or so on perceptions of politicians?
I was kind of hoping you'd take that one. Thanks. Yes. I think if we're going to kind of reinvigorate the soul of our democracy, if we're going to kind of put some kind of the power back into it, the good power of what it could actually be back into the system, politicians have to be on board with that. I mean, they're our representatives, right? We have to trust that they're going to make decisions in our best interests, and they need to trust us as citizens that we've also got kind of really good insight and ideas that can help them. I think if we're going to do that, if we're going to persuade politicians to change the way they do things, which is really difficult, right? Standing on the outside and wagging our finger and saying you should be doing it differently is not going to cut it, right? Nobody likes to be told that they're getting it wrong. But it is about finding the things that are going to make their job easier, because everybody does want that. Everybody, their job is incredibly hard. I couldn't be a politician. I'm actually really in awe of the people that can be, because I think so. Say again?
I'm sorry, I disagree quite strongly about this idea that politicians are sitting there waiting or they're incredibly busy. You only have to look at the parliamentary agenda at the moment. It is almost devoid of anything, and they are sitting in a comfortable place. I nearly said even louder, I do apologise. The best thing that could happen to this country would be for Guy Fawkes to have actually been successful. And I'm sorry, but there is a consensus in here about asking for change. But there are two different things you're asking for. One is changing policy, and one is public administration. And they are very, very different. Politicians at the moment dominate the first, which is national policy making. Local government, Miriam, follows what central government dictates, particularly in England. And you've got to make up your mind. You can't do both. You've got to make up your mind. You're doing public administration and involving the citizens, or are you trying to change policy? And I'm sorry, the British Parliament will resist anything that affects that monopoly. And it's naive to think they will not.
Okay, so I think that probably that's another panel. So that's a good idea. I think maybe just for now, for sure. I mean, Miriam, would you like to finish any of the point that you were making? Or, I mean, absolutely noted, and as I say, perhaps another panel.
I think all I'd say is that we have to find what's going to make it in politicians' interests and what's in our best interests to make the change. I think there are politicians, we've got to appeal to their better angels. I think there are people who've come into politics to make a difference. No, not everybody. I'm as cynical as you about quite a lot of people and about quite a lot of the way things are done. Absolutely. But I do believe that it's possible to do things differently. And I think the evidence from Ireland, from Canada, from Australia, from huge amounts of Europe who are way ahead of us on this stuff shows that actually it makes a massive difference and it can rebuild that trust that we've got in our institutions, and it means you get governed properly.
Can I just make a couple of points? One is I disagree profoundly, and let me explain why. Because democratic politics is the way we resolve our differences without violence. So when people are airily suggesting that we blow up politicians, I'm sorry, I don't play that game. The fact is, we should be able to disagree without being disagreeable or without permissioning the kind of behaviour that we've seen from some seriously bad politicians, like Donald Trump, who were encouraging violence on the 6th of January. So in that sense, that's a red line for me, and I think it's important that we say it. The second point is, we can have endless panels complaining about the politicians, and goodness knows there's enough material for those endless panels, but surely if we believe anything together, it's that politics isn't a spectator sport, it's a participation sport. And that places obligations on politicians, but it also places obligations on us. Because ultimately, democracy is how we do democracy together. And in that sense, I think there are powerful lessons in terms of what Jane describes in Ireland, what we've seen in Canada. One of the striking features of Westminster is just how parochial it is. And in that sense, there are great examples of where actually citizens' voices can be heard. I think we need not to side with the cynics in suggesting nothing can change. We need to raise our sights and say, actually, very close to the United Kingdom, there are some brilliant examples of the difference that citizens' assemblies can make.
And on that, we're going to bring tonight to a close, partly because I've heard over here, and I've heard rumours, no humour, it's deadly serious about this, that the canapes here at the Science Gallery are much better than we usually get at the Strand campus, so we need to go and find that out. But it only remains to say thank you so much for coming along, for participating so fully, and especially thank you to the brilliant panel for all their thoughts. I forgot to trail that.